Okay, well, good afternoon. Thank you for coming to our annual CSD Exchange in Democratic Politics. And I'm very happy this time we've got two very distinguished speakers. Well, our own John McDonnell doesn't need any presentation because everybody will know that he is the shadow Chancellor for the Exchequers. But maybe Paul Magnette needs a little bit more of introduction. Paul Magnette is from the Belgian Socialist Party. He's the mayor of Charleroi, and he was in fact Prime Minister of Wallonia between 2014 and 2017, during which his defiant obstinance over the comprehensive trade of economic agreement between the EU Commission and Ottawa, the famous CETA, well, he managed to delay it for several months, and that was due to some kind of strange, Belgian politics is a very bizarre thing, because we've got three communities, and for instance, the federal government cannot, this treaty needed to be ratified by all of the nation in the EU. But in the case of Belgium, there was no federal government that could do that, so it needed to be confirmed by we've got three communities, a small German, a big Walloon, and a even bigger, no, I'm afraid, big Flemish, yes. And in fact, it was ratified by everybody in Europe except the small group of Walloon. And I must say I was extremely proud by not only am I Walloon, but I'm also from Charleroi. So you can imagine how I was proud that we were standing against. And well, finally, of course, it had been to accept the things, but well, Paul was telling me it was incredible the way in which, he was people like, how do you dare? Who you think you are? You little Walloon, and you are stopping. Maybe you can at some point, tell her this story, because I think it's quite interesting. But I must say, this opposition made some kind of hero of him in a lot of the European left. So it's great to have him here among us. And so we are going to discuss about the future of social democracy. I'm going to ask, we are not going to have, the traditional way, a long presentation and another one. I'm going to try to establish a kind of dialogue among our two speakers. I'm going to ask a few questions, but I hope that they will also ask, each other questions. So it's really not something which is terribly formal. So my first question, which of course may be a bit obvious, and not it. Well, why are most social democratic parties in crisis? Because if we look, at recent election and the state of social democratic parties in Europe, well, it's not very comforting. PASOK in Greece, PVDA in Netherlands, SPE in Austria, SPD in Germany, PS in France, more recently the PD, Partito Democratico in Italy. Well, always, I think the PD, for instance, it was its worst result in history. And I think for the SPD in Germany too, so they are definitively in crisis. Well, they are, by the way, I wouldn't say the Belgium is it's not as bad as PASOK and PVDA and the SPE and Socialist Party in France. But I must say that, in fact, there are two exceptions to this panorama. Well, one, a very big exception, of course, this is what we want to discuss, the fact that, in fact, in Britain, contrary to the decline that we are seeing, the Labour Party under Corbyn, in fact, is really he's become the biggest party of the left in Europe. It's almost 600,000 members, and it's thriving. And then, of course, to be fair, there are two parties. Well, first in Portugal, the Socialists we are in coalition with the Communists and the Bloco de Esquerda, well, there it's okay. And more recently, but we don't know, of course, what's going to happen. Of course, in Spain, the SPE managed with a vote of non-confidence to get rid of Rajoy, and Pedro Sanchez is now in the government. So far, he's been doing quite a few things which seem, rather promising. For instance, there are more women in government as minister than men. Very, very, I think it's the only country where I'm not sure, but at least it's really something special. And of course, you all know that Spain offered a place for the Aquarius when it was refused by Malta and by Italy and by the French also. They don't want to say it too clearly, but obviously, they could have offered refuse for Aquarius. So his two first moves have been rather positive, but of course it's a very, very minority government. 87, I think, million or more for 350. So even with the support of Podemos, which of course was very important, very vital for them to win this vote of non-confidence, we don't know. But at least, let's say, it's a little bit better than what's happening in other countries. But of course, obviously, the very interesting exception here, and that goes completely against the trend of decline, is the Labour Party under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn. So, I want to ask my two speakers to tell me where do they see the origin of this crisis? I'm not at the moment yet asking John McDonnell to say why is that not the case with Britain, because in fact there will be the second question later in which I'm going to ask them, what can they be reformed or go revert the trend, and also explain the success of of Labour. But to give them what is, according to them, one of the main reasons for this decline of social democracy that we are witnessing in most of the countries in Europe. So maybe, Paul, can you begin?
Thank you very much, Chantal. Thank you to John McDonnell for being here for this discussion, and thank you everyone to be present for this debate. But despite the fact that we have a very, very nice weather and that the debate takes place right during happy hours time, so we are all longing for a nice beer, fresh air outside.
There is no football. If we had had the football, that would have been a catastrophe.
And I won't mention the Belgian-Britain match of last week, so I will not speak about that. It's a very important question, and I think a very intricate one. I try not to be too long, but can you give me 5-6 minutes to start with? Because I think if you want to understand the crisis of social democracy today, I think first we have to realize that this is not just due to recent circumstances or a crisis that started 3, 4, 5 years ago, but it really is a crisis which has very deep roots in the very history of social democracy. And first, we should bear in mind the fact that the success of social democracy is not a rule in history of mankind, but it's a kind of exception. If we look at history in the long distance, in the long period, long length, we see that inequality has been there every time, and that the capacity of political forces to coalesce different social groups, to fight, to build wide majorities, and to reduce inequalities is really the exception in history, even in modern history. And there has been some kind of golden age of social democracy, sometimes between the end of the Second World War and the end of the 1970s. And we live sometimes with sort of the nostalgia of that golden age, and we tend to forget that all the circumstances that made that golden age possible have disappeared. Not all together, but each, I would say there were 4 foundations, and at each decade we've lost one of those foundations. First, in the 1970s, we experienced the crisis of the Keynesian model. We had been so dependent on this idea of growth, economic growth, and redistribution of wealth, on this idea that we would be richer next year than we are this year, and then richer, and we will share that wealth into one part for the worker, one part for the holders of the capital, and one part for the community, via public services and social security, and progress, which had been a very odd idea in the history of mankind, had become, in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, progress had become the big idea. And everybody, we had lived with so big progress at that time. We had never experienced so much social mobility, so much reduction of inequalities and reduction of poverty, so much progress in every capacity of mankind than during those 30 years, that when it stopped, it really was something that was completely unexpected, and we had been used to living with the idea that society was going forward and going in the direction of less inequality and more progress, that when it stopped, when simply growth was not there anymore, we were sort of completely unable to understand how to renovate our political message and political model. Second crisis in the 1980s, at the end of the 1980s, is the fall of the geopolitical order which had made social democracy possible and so successful. We had lived there again in the time of the Cold War, with the USSR on the one hand and the US on the other hand, and we could say, well, we have the US, which is really free but very unequal model on the one hand. We have the USSR on the other hand, which is very much more equalitarian than in the US, but without a lot of public freedom. And we have us, the European social democracy. And the European social democracy was, to some extent, the best of both worlds. And we could say we are better than those who live in the US and those who live in the USSR. And the sort of cold, permanent geopolitical framework of the Cold War offered us a sort of international framework that was very easy for us to keep doing what we were doing without having to think about the evolution of the international order, because it seemed to be so stable over time. And then when the Berlin Wall fell, we were sort of there again. We had no alternative vision of what the international order could be. We, of course, had the European Union and the sort of vision of multilateral international order that could be built, but no real clear doctrine of how we saw the international organization. The third crisis in the 1990s it's more sort of a silent revolution. It's a very deep transformation of the nature of Western democracy. There are lots of books about that. One of the best of those books is Peter Mayer, a colleague political scientist who died recently. His book called Ruling the Void describes the sort of hollowing of the state and hollowing of democracy that took place in the 1990s, with the fact that the numbers of members, and of course the Labour Party nowadays is an exception, but the number of members of big mass organizations such as political parties, trade unions and so on declined very rapidly. Electoral volatility was much stronger than in the former generations, and we lived in sort of a liquid and hollow democracy, which was very different from the mass organization that we had in the 1950s, 60s, 80s, and 70s, and even until the 90s. And finally, in the last 20 years, we have experienced a very deep sociological transformation of Western societies. Just to give two data, the proportion of young people leaving school before the age of 18 has been cut by half in one generation. And in the same generation, the number of young people who have acquired a higher education degree has doubled. If you take those two data together, it means that the real nature of the society, how the different social groups combine, and how the individuals live their own perception of their membership to this or that social group has been completely transformed. And if you take those four elements, the crisis of Keynesianism, the crisis of the geopolitical order without any alternative doctrine that we have, a new, more flexible and less grass and less rooted notion of democracy, and a society which is not the working class, middle class versus the big owners on the other hand. We live in a completely different order than from that of the golden age of social democracy, and we haven't really found a new manner to, and I keep it here to have elements of answer for the next question, so you asked me to answer why crisis. I think really because the roots of the crisis are very deep, and this implies that the renewal of social democracy also has to be very deep. We have to restore, I think, the values of fighting inequalities and privileges and the manning up the few and so on and so forth are still there, and the desire for that kind of doctrine is still there, but it needs to be completely renovated to be adapted to a sociological, international and democratic order which is completely different from that of the golden age of social democracy.
Thank you. John, what is your view on that?
Let me just say as an aside, I'm very strong in my pride about my Irish roots, but my children point out to me that my mother's name was Brunson, and so therefore I'm called the Belgian in the family. In Norfolk, where Huguenots came across. So you have 3 Belgians tonight. Look, let me build on what Paul said, because I don't disagree with that at all. I completely concur. If you take the British experience of the post-war settlement was the height of social democracy in this country and across Europe elsewhere. But eventually capital had said enough is enough. And so we got to the late 1970s in this country, and the election of Margaret Thatcher was on the basis of capital no longer either being willing or able to provide the, if you like, the redistribution of elements that were demanded by organised labour, and particularly organised labour via the trade union movement. And they needed an economic theory to justify the withdrawal of some of those benefits and the with undermining of the welfare state that we created. And eventually you had some bizarre politicians like, people have forgotten his name now, but Sir Keith Joseph advising Margaret Thatcher. And along came our first elements of neoliberalism was what they call monetarism. It was to restrict monetary supply in order to undermine the role of the state and to undermine the welfare state, but also to cut wages, and then rolling upon that under industrial struggles that undermined the trade union movement itself. And this was capital demanding so far and no further, but also withdrawing some of the benefits that had been gained as a result of not just the struggles in the post-war period, but the struggles from the 1930s onwards, both here and right the way across Europe as well. So we went through the 1980s, and what happened is what Chantal's been writing about for the last number of years, which was actually the political theory of neoliberalism that evolved from monetarism, actually hegemonised the political thinking in this country. And if you look at what happened to the Labour Party after several electoral defeats and industrial defeats for the trade union movement, particularly with the miners' strike in this country, the longest miners' strike in our history. And what then happened, you could describe the labour and trade union movement as defeated and defeatist. And as a result of that, became imbued and hegemonised by neoliberal theory themselves. And so eventually win government in 1997 because of the exhaustion to a large extent of the Tories in power itself. And although they try to reinvent some elements of social democracy, even where they do, like investment in the NHS and welfare services, etc., they do in a style that is up to the benefit of capital. So in other words, you introduce the private finance initiatives, and you look at the privatisations of elements of our public services as well. You then go into that period where which I found bizarre at the time, and where you get called then the Great Moderation, where we're in an economic situation where everything has been moderated. We can manage capitalism now. There will be no crisis, and we'll overcome boom and bust. And that was the expression used by a Labour Chancellor on a repeated basis. So I think for those parties that got drawn in and hegemonised in that way, as soon as that economic crisis came, as soon as the banking crash came, and people saw the reality of the economic system, how it operates. We compared it to that scene in The Wizard of Oz where they pulled the curtain back and you see the wizard with all these levers being pulled, and you understand actually that the system itself is manipulated in that way. And then actually it's even worse than that. You realise even those people in the city who are meant to be managing the system, they don't know how it operates either. So it's complete panic and chaos. But those parties that have been implicated in agreeing that there is a great moderation, the end of history, can you remember that one? Mm-hmm. You know? And also that there'd be no more boom and bust. Of course they were discredited along with the system itself. And what then happened is, well, PASOK in particular, but depending on the contingency of what country you're operating in and the political system you're operating in, either those political parties, social democratic parties, radicalised themselves very, very quickly, But in the UK experience, because of our political system, which is first past the post, the operation of political parties outside of the main political parties, it's almost impossible to achieve electoral advantage in any form. So therefore the struggle had to be within the existing Social Democratic Party and within the trade union itself. And that's what happened. And that's why the Labour Party has been radicalised in that way, because people saw the system as it was, they revolted against it, and were looking for an alternative, and they looked to see if they could develop an alternative within whatever structures they possibly that were available to them. And in this country, the only electoral structure was still within the Labour Party. There were some people who went off into minor parties, etc., but never had the ability to be elected. So what we have now, I think is really fascinating, is having got over the banking, having got past the financial crash, bailing out the banks, etc., with quantitative easing. Then the Tories get elected and you have 8 years of austerity. The grievance and the anger about how people have been treated hasn't gone away. And I think that's resulted in the opportunity, therefore, for the left within the Labour Party and the trade union movement to recruit people on a scale that we've not seen before, maybe in generations.
But don't go yet. You're already moving to the second question.
Let me just run alongside that as well. The breakdown of the hegemony of neoliberalism is before us now. And I think we're at an absolutely critical moment where the ideological dominance has been broken and people are looking for an alternative. But it isn't just within the Labour and trade union movements. It is also the build-up of all those social movements that have developed during that period as well. And for the first time, you can see the potential of coalescing of a number of those movements that are looking for radical change. So I think there's a potential, we'll come on to this, there's the potential now for social democracy to be at the heart of the creation of a new political and social movement in a way that we've not been before.
In my words, to move to left populism, but let's
read the book yet.
In fact, Paul, I think that John is right to insist that, because the way you presented it is a little bit too small. But it was a political struggle, and things could have been different. I think if in the case, in fact, in Britain. We lived this much more strongly because there was, of course, the offensive of Thatcher. So probably is clearer is that there was a political struggle. It's not simply a process of things. There was thing could have been different. But I want to wonder, and of course, I'm Belgian, but I left Belgium a long time ago, and I don't really know much about politics in Belgium in recent years. What would correspond in Belgium to the Thatcher moment? Did you ever have a moment in which clearly one see social democracy defeated and neoliberalism becoming hegemonic, or not?
Well, there was a Thatcher moment, I would say, everywhere in Europe, certainly also in France, in Germany, in
but Belgium. Not in the same way, because in France, let's say, if you understand by the Thatcher moment, the move to neoliberalism, yes. But it was done much more smoothly. For instance, in France, it was over a long period of time, and there was not a moment when clearly.
The Chirac government was.
But in fact, some people say already.
In Belgium, for example,
some people say already with Mitterrand, after 2 years, when. Okay. But I think the case of Britain was clear. The Victoria Margaret Thatcher was she really established a political frontier. And what was
we had that in Belgium too. We had someone who was a young liberal minister in charge of budget and finance, who then became prime minister and who now is the leader of the liberal group within the European Parliament, Guy Verhofstadt, to name him, who was called Baby Thatcher at that time. So he was really considered. The difference is the political structure. As we don't have a majoritarian democracy, what happens? We have a coalition all the time. And so we had struggles within the government during the 1990s and then the years 2000s. We nearly always had a liberal component of the coalition, but always with the socialists who were there too. And so I understand it's very hard to understand for a British citizen how the socialist and the conservative liberal can be in the same government, but that's part of a proportional democracy and coalition government. And so we managed to reduce the extent of change that was put forward by the liberals but with very high political cost, because the only message that we had at that time, we were in a very sort of defensive compromises. We were making compromises and we tried to protect and to rescue and save all what we could save of social security and public services. There never was in Belgium some kind of ideological turn. It was a bit like in France. I mean, Jospin and the Jospin generation were never fascinated by Blair, the Third Way, or the Neue Mitte in Germany. They remained really French and socialist, and the same for us. But we were in coalitions with liberals and conservatives, and we had to make compromises. And the big slogan that we had was, if I translate, without us it would be worse, which was true. It was true, but which certainly is not enough. It is not enough, because even trade unions say, well, of course, yeah, we know that it would be worse. And now that we are in the opposition everywhere, they can realize that without us. So we are sort of experiencing a sort of Thatcherite moment right now in Belgium, because we have a coalition of the Flemish nationalists and the French-speaking liberals, which are making all what we have impeded them from doing when we were in a coalition.
Is that the first time that the socialists are not in government?
Since 1987, which means we had been there for nearly 30 years. And during those 30 years, we had kept making progresses in social security and so on and so forth. And more than that, we had blocked lots of reforms, like pension at 67. They did it immediately. We have a very typically Belgian system of automatic indexation of wages, which is really in the advantage of the workers. They have also reduced it, and many other reforms that they couldn't do as long as we were there. And now they feel free to do all what they couldn't do when we were there. So we are sort of 30 years later experiencing a Thatcherite moment in Belgium.
Yeah. And I think part of the reason as well, there's different contingencies really. Part of the reason as well is that the Labour Party here is the formation of it by the trade union movement, and the trade unions as part of that party itself were a way, almost like a stabiliser. Sometimes a stabiliser from the right and sometimes a stabiliser from the left. So there was an element of that. But elsewhere, as in Greece and Spain as well, Podemos, people could form other parties. They would stand a chance of being elected and having some influence and power, etc. In this country, they couldn't. So the struggle, you either had to, sort of fight or fright, was a classic psychological reaction. You either had to give up or go away. Well, a few years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, I was looking forward to a quiet retirement, and I was going to sit at the back of the halls moaning about what, it's all gone wrong because they never listened to me, that sort of thing. And I think that's what a lot of the left did for a period, or you fought within the Labour Party in the hope that some change would come. And I think what's happened now is that combination of those who fought within the Labour Party now begin to win the arguments, increasingly so, but also those that left have come back in. Then the new generation comes in, largely young people, but also from social movements as well, which is fascinating. But it's interesting because you can burn the brand. Your brand can be burned completely by association with some of the ideas and the implementation of some of the policies that you've imbued as a result of the hegemony of neoliberalism. And I think the Labour Party came close to that, but just about retrieved it as a result of a lot of the work that was done, particularly in the wider movement rather than maybe the parliamentary party.
Yeah.
What's the situation with the Parti Socialist in Belgium?
Well, I think, to come back a moment, on the British case is very, very interesting, and you mentioned it as one of the ways that needs to be looked at more closely elsewhere in Europe to understand where we have hopes for social democracy, because really, I mean, the description you made of all social democratic parties in Europe nowadays is just a nightmare. I mean, apart from Portugal, it really is the only one where we really have a lot of hope. The rest is really a nightmare. The big question is, to come back to John's first statement, is the financial crisis started 10 years ago. I remember I was a member of the federal government at that time. I remember, you're perfectly right, it's a deep factual crisis of the liberal conservative doctrine and ideology. In the facts, when you talk with the citizens, nobody believes in this liberal conservative ideology anymore. So there's a lot of anger against the banks, against the international finance, against the wealthy people who do not pay enough taxes, and so on and so forth. But the left does not benefit from that. 10 years later, the left remains either very weak or deeply divided. And this is the biggest challenge that we have. How can we turn this anger against capitalism, against a sort of plutocracy and oligarchic political system which is there. How can we turn this anger into hope that another way is possible and that another politics is possible? What is very interesting in the British political system, and there again it's a question of structure, is the fact that if you are against the system, you can indeed see there is no other option than to try and get into the Labour Party and change the Labour Party from inside, because you know that the rules of the game make it that if you want progressive politics, you need a left Labour Party. The problem in proportional democracies is that there is a capacity for others to create political movements, such as Podemos in Spain, such as Syriza in Greece, such as the Linke in Germany, and so on and so forth. We have the Parti des Travailleurs in Belgium, which is close to that kind of... It's an old Maoist party, but they managed to sort of rebrand their message by using that sort of anger against capitalism, that desire for more radical changes. But the consequence is that the left is divided into different political parties, and this is mechanically this is an asset for the right. Because if the left is divided, the right has got sort of a boulevard to rebuild the majority, and this is the kind of when you look, Spain will be another very interesting laboratory. In Portugal, the Social Democratic Party managed to make an agreement with the communists and with the extreme left, as you said, although they are not in the majority, but negotiating in the parliament and ruling with a minority government. In Spain, we will see. The PSOE only has 85 seats, and while the majority would be 176, which means they're very far away from a majority.
Even with Podemos, they are not.
Even with Podemos and even with Ciudadanos, so they would need to make a very wide coalition that would not be possible.
You can't think of a coalition between Podemos, Ciudadanos, and PSOE.
The Spanish case is very interesting. If Sanchez manages to sort of embody via as Prime Minister a new vision with the beautiful act that he made with the Aquarius and so on and so forth, and then he provokes elections and he can win a much wider majority and make a coalition with someone else, maybe. But again, if you look at Europe as a whole, Britain is suddenly a hope, but the British political system is something which is not easy to... the situation is completely different in nearly all other democracies on the continent.
I wouldn't want you to think it's sweetness and light within the Labour Party. And the mechanisms that you can use within if you like, a single party social democratic system in that sense. Even though we've got a small Liberal Party and a fairly tiny Green Party now, that would work alongside it. It's still the Labour Party dominates the left in that sense. But we have, we call ourselves a broad church, so there's a whole group within our movement which are simply social reformers rather than socialists or social democrats, but nevertheless. But the way that we've decided to manage that future is by always radicalising every discussion that we have and forcing the pace all the time. And it's the book that Leo Panitch and Sam Gimbrich have just come out with, The Socialist Challenge, looks at the experience of Syriza and looks at the Sanders campaign and looks at the early days of the Corbyn movement within the Labour Party itself. And it's interesting, they seize upon partly what you've written on, Chantal, as well. One of the first things we did for the election was create a manifesto that was deeply popular. More popular than we realised it could be, because it was relatively radical, not as far as some of us would have liked it to go, but it was radical enough to enthuse people. So we thought the way to bring alongside even some of those dissidents within our party is to force the pace all the time. And then by forcing the pace, you realise actually you can then break down the old hegemony and open up a real debate within the party itself. And I think that's one of the things that we've done. I think one of the issues now for us is, having done that, where do we go next? And the point that you made is about lifting people's hopes, but also offering them the opportunities. Now people realise actually you can change the system. You can bring things back into public ownership. We can cooperate and introduce cooperation within our economy itself. You can start looking at different methods of how we teach each other, how we educate, how we treat each other in our society, how we plan. So all of a sudden it's opened up a whole new vista of debate and understanding of the world. And I think enforcing the pace in that way, in some ways you can overcome some of the divisions that take place. And also what we're trying to do is build into our debate and saying don't mistake democracy for division. Enable and encourage dissent. In the history, just this historical, and this is, I'm part of the archaeology of politics, and I'm so old in this country. In the Greater London Council, when we were on the GLC, the old Ken Lewis's administration, we had the theory there was in and against the state. So as the point you made, you go in, you get elected into the state, but you recognise the state as a set of institutions, but it's also a relationship. And it's a relationship of dominance, largely, for ordinary working class people. So therefore you go in with the state and you empower yourself to pass that power across. And in the old GLC we did that, and I give the example, Richard's here, part of it. We opened up County Hall, so every night, in every room, there'll be a group of people. They'll be arguing about something, whether it was policing, whether it was LGBT rights, whether it was radio, and anything you could think of, and literally every room was bursting. There were occasional punch-ups and things like that, but every room would be buzzing with ideas and creativity. And in that way, those ideas then filtered into the administration itself, but those very people in those rooms were then empowered, often with resources, to implement the policies as well. So we're trying to engender that on a national scale, on a regional, local scale in our debate. So anyone who has an idea or even dissents is immediately incorporated into the debate itself and becomes part of the movement. And I think that's the lesson that we've learned from the old systems, which are so centralised and bureaucratised as a result of that nature of the social democratic settlement of the post-war period, which was very statist and very centralised as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but it seems to me here that, particularly after what you say, Paul, the electoral system is really something that
it's a big difference.
Crucial.
Yeah, sure.
It's crucial, because, and that probably is why the example of the Labour Party, of course you can learn a lot about, but when it comes to coming to power, it's going to be much more complicated.
Although
so how would you see the possibility to find ways in which a movement like that could.
As I would say, in a sense, in a proportional democracy, we have different kind of lefts, and they are a broad church too. And the issue is not that different. I mean, you have to reconcile different sensitivities and say, let's try and find something which is a common message within the Labour Party, and use the dynamics, the internal dynamics of the party itself, to try and find a number of messages that can be shared by different movements or different sensibilities within the party. We have to try and find convergences between the new radical left, the social democracy, the Greens, some elements of Christian democracy which are still there and more progressive than the rest, and so on. So trying to coalesce different social groups and different versions of the left is a universal challenge for the left everywhere. It would be the same in the US for the Democratic Party to try within the Democratic Party, North and South and East and West and Midwest and the rest. Now lots of geographic and ideological and religious and so on and so forth different. So the challenge is always there. What is very interesting in the case of the Labour Party, at least for us seen from outside, is also the process of the election of Corbyn and how it was a real struggle within the party, which was not just a question of institutionalization and so on and so forth, but really the way Corbyn and the team that you formed with him managed to sort of jeopardize, to challenge really what had been a movement of very deep professionalization of the political class, to use Peter Mayer's words again. There's a phrase in French which says there are less differences between there are more differences between two socialists, of which one is an MP, than between two MPs, of which one is a socialist, which means that when you are an MP, you are an MP, and the professionalization of politics is really something which is, and the fact that there was this group of MPs which was really holding the whole party, but it would be interesting for us, at least for me, to know more about that, but that a group that was coming that was using not just the classic political struggles within the party, but other elements coming from outside. The fact that you opened the elections to non-members and to expand the number of members and to open this to the society itself is really something which has played a role. And Pedro Sanchez has made exactly the same experience. I mean, Pedro, I remember meeting him at a moment when he was just thinking of abandoning politics because he was nowhere. He had lost the internal elections and so on and so forth. And he said, well, I would never win because we have this group of MPs which are holding everything and they are closing all debates. And I'm convinced that we need a radicalization of the socialist discourse in Spain, otherwise we would leave all the movement to Podemos and the rest. But I cannot make it because this old sort of establishment, I can't find out the words, within the Socialist Party was blocking everything. And then Pedro took the risk of making a tour of Spain with his bus and a small group of people, and he went everywhere in Spain and tried to convince that yes, it was possible to have another vision of the PSOE and that this would make a difference in the relationship with Podemos and the rest. And he won the elections. And after he won the election...
Wait a second. He won the election as leader. He
won the election as leader.
Yes,
but even after that, there was another stage. He still needed to be confirmed by the Congress, which is really strange, which shows that the establishment of the party itself really defies the members. Because if you're elected by the members, normally you are the chairman, the general secretary, as I say, of the party. But then he still needed to be confirmed. And this too, I mean, the fact that he went against the establishment of his own political party helped put lots of movements within Spain into a movement and support him and bring them back to the Socialist Party.
Be optimistic concerning because look, I mean, of course we are not going to discuss about Spanish politics here, but it's evident that the people know it's a victor. The fact that Rajoy has been, put out is not a victory of the people wanting, to have a PSOE government. It's because there was a coalition of people from independentistas and non-independentistas, because they just want, the only thing they had in common and one they wanted Rajoy out. It doesn't mean that all that is going to support.
I wasn't talking
the PSOE. I mean, the PSOE is still, and in fact, even under Sanchez. And by the way, I think it's a very good move. I definitively prefer him as a leader. But it doesn't mean that the PSOE is recovered. It is probably in a better condition for launching an hegemonic campaign, but all that is very precarious, I'm afraid, and it's not sure how long he's going to be able to maintain himself in government. So, because when you say that everybody knows Jean Laurent, it's not around the figure of Sanchez, it's against Rajoy that they...
I was talking of that stage. I was talking of the stage when Sanchez became Secretary General of the party. As John said, he played on dissent. He dared to be against the leadership of the party and to contest the leadership of the party and to take the risk of, yes, leading the party to some kind of division, but this internal dissent repoliticized the choice of the leader, and some people who said, well, I want to be part of the choice of this leader, so yes, I would join the PSOE to make sure that Sanchez would win and that more radical message within the PSOE would win than if the classic leadership from Andalusia had won.
So, no, we are going to try to imagine, but we've already talked about that. But do you agree with what John is saying about that there is a real crisis of neoliberalism and there is a great opportunity at this moment to really change politics, to create a new hegemony?
Of course, we all agree that it's a crisis of neoliberalism and a crisis of that sort of liberal hegemony ideologically. But again, as I said, how can we make sure that this crisis of neoliberalism will be a success for the left? This remains a very open challenge.
No, exactly. No, but that's what he said. It's a big opportunity, but it's also a big challenge, because this crisis can, in fact, and so far we could say that this crisis has been more used by right-wing
populism, yeah.
than is not. But yeah, I think it's a very crucial moment precisely because, in fact, it's quite interesting. And I was thinking recently that what we are living here at the moment is something similar to what Karl Polanyi in the Great Transformation mentioned about the counter movement. He said there is a movement of commodification, and then there is a counter movement, but this counter movement can go in very different direction. It doesn't mean at all that's going to be progressive politics. It can be much more authoritarian, and I think we are really in a moment like that, no?
Well, it's interesting that people are quoting Polanyi now more and more as it's come to the fore. Of course, it can go either way, and at the moment in this country, I don't think it's a sealed deal. Only a few weeks ago, to all our shock and horror, we had tens of thousands of right-wing fascists marching in for support of this Tommy Robinson campaign on a huge number, much bigger than any of us thought was possible still. So there's that underlying right, and we've gone through the UKIP experience as well, we've gone through the Brexit vote as well. But there is such a thing as agency, and that's what we're about. Just going through the history of it, on the Corbyn element, if you like, phenomenon, the objective reality was the crash. Then after that, 5 years of hard austerity. So by the time we get to the election 2015, which Ed Miliband loses, people have had enough. They've not had enough sufficiently to get rid of a Tory government because they didn't see the Labour Party as sufficiently as an alternative. That was part of the problem. And I thought Ed Miliband was, and is, an excellent person, but unfortunately was constrained at that point in time by what was around him, both in terms of personnel, but also in terms of the structures. Well, I don't want to go into personalities, but I think he's a better dancer than the Chancellor. But you get to 2015, so the objective reality is in our favour in the sense of people have had enough, they had enough austerity, they want change. And there was a window of opportunity, and it was only one window of opportunity that we had, which was Ed Miliband had changed the voting arrangements for the election of the leader. If we hadn't had that, the party was completely bureaucratised. The old Trotsky analysis of the leader replacing the committee replacing the party replacing it had gone that far under Blair and Mattis and others. And, selection of candidates, it was almost impossible to get selected as a candidate if you're a left-winger. God knows how many of us survived during that period. But that window of opportunity which changed the voting arrangements suddenly gave us the opportunity for, agency to take place, and that's what happened. And, I chaired and organised Jeremy's campaign a bit, and I never thought we were going to win. And I thought we might get 20 or 30% of the vote and demonstrate the left is still alive out there somewhere, but that was as far as it would go. So about halfway we realised, I do the joke, but it's true, when I started off organising the meetings, I'd say to our team, book a room with no more than 50 places in it, and make sure you can take the chairs away. So there's standing room only and that sort of thing. We did the first ones and 500 turned up, and then 1,000 went on like that. So it surprised us, shouldn't have done, but it surprised us the scale of the demand for change. And I think that's where we're at. We still haven't achieved yet the clarity of narrative about what that change is. We tried it in the manifesto with a whole range of ideas, but not necessarily comprehensive narrative, and I think that's where we're moving on to. The good thing, we've opened up the debate, and also we've not been forced back, because when we went into the general election, 24 points behind, the Tories called that election on the basis they could crush us, and we were achieving 38% of the vote. We're now at 40% in the polls, so we haven't fallen back. Others will say we should be miles ahead, but actually I think that 40% base gives us the springboard for the next stage. But agency does come into it. I'm not such a determinist that, just because the world is that people are reacting that way, they can go either way, and it is a left-right fight. We've got to be, and I think it comes out of the Panitch book, we've got to be sure two things. One is making sure that the mass movement that we're building is based upon a mass educative movement. So we've got political education, which we haven't had in this country for a generation at least. We're out there in the communities itself. So there's lots of events that are taking place which demonstrate that people are thirsting for that. But then secondly also that those in elected positions are linked to the mass base that we're building, but also understand the nature of the state and how it can be used, and sufficiently professional when they go into elected positions and government in particular to use the state effectively in empowering people. And that's, I think, where we're at. it's an exciting moment, but also it's a challenging moment, and it can go either way still.
Yeah, no, it was a Machiavellian moment of conjunction between Fortuna and Virtu, no? You've got to have the moment of Fortuna. But yeah, and of course it's important to have discourse available, because if you think that what's been happening in Italy, for instance, I think that if there had been a movement, really left movement, I mean, things would not have gone that way. But it is impossible, you know. So there was really a rejection of the, and there was no alternative. There is not only a left discourse that could articulate that in a progressive direction, you know. So I mean, what's the situation in Belgium from that point of view?
Well, of course, you need the general climate, which must be, in a sense, which must go in a direction that is open to progress and the need for change and the desire for more radical change. Then you need to have the structures within the political system and within the political parties, and then you also need to have the leaders. I mean, the question of the persons, although I'm Marxist, I'm a structuralist, or what you want, nevertheless, if you don't have the right person at the right moment, it doesn't work. And we were all struck, I think, by the similarity between the success of Bernie Sanders in the US in the presidential election campaign and Jeremy Corbyn here in Britain. Suddenly we have people who have been there for 30 years or more. I mean, they're not just the young guy coming from nowhere and being the new big thing. Yeah, but at some point, the same person with the same message in different circumstances becomes the right man at the right place at the right moment, and then you have an opportunity to win. And it's really, of course, a pity that the US Democratic Party did not realize that they had more chances with Bernie Sanders than with Mrs. Clinton. But maybe he could have won against Trump, and this remains an open question. I think in the rest of Europe, the most difficult challenge nowadays is, as you said, political education. We have those. We are at a moment when people who are against liberal conservative ideology and capitalism and want radical change and so on and so forth, either go to some kind of radical left, which remains unclear in terms of what they really want, in terms of participation to taking responsibility and that kind of thing. When you listen to, I know we would disagree on this, Chantal, but when you listen to Mélenchon, when you listen to Podemos, when you listen to the Parti des Travailleurs in Belgium, when you listen to the Socialist Party in the Netherlands, and so on and so forth, what they have in common is that their relationship to power remains very problematic. They're not saying, well, I would go to power in that kind of circumstance, and these are the changes that I would make. It took a very long time for us, the Socialists and Social Democrats, to manage to build a doctrine of this. I mean, I remember, no, I don't remember because I was not born at that time, but I've read it in the history books. When you read in the history books the debates in the night at the start of the 20th century of should we become members of parliament first? Yes. And there was a long, very long debate. Then we became members of parliament, we played the game of the parliament, that should we become members of the government, in coalition or not in coalition? It took 2 or 3 or 4 generations before we managed to build a vision of how we can, of our relationship to power, how we can take responsibility, and why it is worth taking responsibility, because we can make reforms that will improve the lives of the people. And we managed to demonstrate that when we were in charge,
that's never been in question for Podemos or for Jean-Luc Mélenchon, and I disagree completely with putting together the PTB with Mélenchon and Podemos.
I agree with you that it's not
honestly,
the same.
I mean, this is not the same. PTB, not long ago, they were still defending North Korea. I mean, come on.
No, of course.
I mean,
it's not the same.
No.
Ours
I
is
think
worse.
that something that I think is very important is to make the distinction between extreme left. You know, for instance, Mélenchon is not extreme left. This is ridiculous to say that. Podemos is not extreme left. Those people are, for put that in the category, what I call radical reformists. They want to come to power, been in and against the state. You know, it is never. They want to come to power. The difference, for instance, between in France the NPA, le Nouveau Parti Anticapitaliste, and La France Insoumise, is that the Nouveau Parti Anticapitaliste is not interested in coming to power at all. You know, and I think it's I don't know so much about the PTB, but I think they've got nothing to do with the PTB than certainly nothing to do with Mélenchon. So it's not extreme left. Extreme left is the kind of discourse that, basically we want to break completely with the old institution of liberal democracy to do something completely different. This is not what Mélenchon is saying. This is not what Podemos, and this is not what Tsipras was saying with
I would make it, of course, you're right to make differences between all those parties. Nevertheless, you will never convince me that Mélenchon has a very clear doctrine of where and when he wants to exercise responsibility.
If you read the manifesto of
I've read it. I think it's very happy to be where he is.
As detailed as the program of the...
I would make a difference with Podemos.
Not the few. And it's a claim for eco-socialism, and really very precise.
Sure.
They detail exactly what they want to do in all the... So they really know what they want to do.
If he could be elected president and have an absolute majority, he would of course accept to take responsibility. But in other circumstances...
It's not that he will accept those people who want to come to power.
I worked with Mélenchon, and twice his runs and all the rest of them. Actually, he was quite educative as well. And he was thinking through ideas, and he nourished some of the ideas in the debates. And we had him over here on a regular basis, and I found him a fascinating character himself. And his oratory style as well, I thought was amazing. And I think that he picked up ideas on that. Let me just say, in terms of here, although we were sitting on the back benches, Jeremy for 30 years and me for 20 odd years, I chaired the Socialist campaign group, and I always made, and it was quite a talented group. We had some really good people in it over the years. From Hanover, was founded by Tony Benn. But I always said to them, we're the left, so we have to take our responsibility seriously. So we've got to be in a situation where we could take over government tomorrow. And everyone would laugh at that. I think that will never happen. I said, be ready, be ready. Mm-hmm. And when we ran Jeremy for the leadership, and I stood for the leadership before, I was so popular I couldn't even get on the ballot. But when we ran Jeremy for the leadership, I thought we got 20 or 30% of the vote. We'd be able to negotiate someone in at least junior ministerial position, because we'd been out of position for a decade and a half, a generation and a half. And that was the seriousness of intent that we had. Always be ready to take over. Gordon Brown, Gordon's quite a kind person at times, despite his image, believe it or not. And he always used to say about me, when Jeremy appointed me Shadow Chancellor, Gordon Brown said he's always been Shadow Chancellor. Because we'd put up alternative budgets every year to what they budget for, to stimulate the debate, but also to demonstrate that we could do it. Things changed though, both in terms of the electoral process in the Labour Party, but what also changed as well, and it's almost like the determination of the means of production or whatever, the means of communication changed. And for the first time, we were no longer just a group of newspaper sellers outside in the rain. All of a sudden, we had a whole generation of people on social media communicating in a way that completely bypassed the media. And that's one of the things you picked up in one of your articles, where it completely astounded, both in terms of Jeremy's leadership election, but also in the last general election, astounded the media that they no longer dominated and determined electoral capacity within this country, because people all of a sudden had a separate means of communication and a growing organic voice as well, which was interesting, because coalitions formed by social media so effectively. So those sort of contingencies, or whatever you call them, those changes in history enabled us to have that breakthrough. And the issue to us now is how do we then exploit that breakthrough so we don't fall backwards on it. And it's trying to use every creative way you possibly can. And that's why agency does it. Individuals in the right place at the right time. Richard's here in the last general election when it brought people together and said, look, we took it from Mélenchon. Mélenchon had a good young people, the game. He did the game. So Richard Muller's in Games for the Many, they created Corbyn Run.
Yeah, he was fighting with Merkel on the fiscal campaign.
Jeremy Corbyn running along, grabbing a banker, shaking him, and as the money came down, if you accumulate something, you could introduce a new policy. And that had millions of hits. It's just extraordinary. So it's that level of creativity that we engender within our class to enable us then to confront capital. I think that's happening. I've just been at the Unite conference again. What they're looking at now is not just how they wage the next industrial campaign on wages, etc., but they've developed a detailed industrial strategy which actually is almost written for us when we go into government, and it's just so dynamic. That's coming from the shop floor, the debates and discussions that are going on. And I was there today with Anne Pettifer, one of our economic advisors, and then McCluskey was saying to them, actually what we need to do now is we need to have a whole series of conferences around the country, again, just specifically for the union, the same way the Labour Party has done, just about how we explain the economy and how we can talk about the economy, so people are no longer frightened of economic terms and fully understand them, because actually they're better budgeters than anyone we know, because they're actually having to budget on such low resources every day of the week. And it's that sort of creativity that's come out of all of this. It's unleashed, if you like. I'm saying, I might sound a bit romantic about this, but it has actually unleashed the creativity of our class again.
Yeah, but I think that the Labour Party has got a great advantage precisely because of the liquid unions.
Yeah.
And that's something that Mélenchon doesn't have, unfortunately. Not that he doesn't want to, but and that's Podemos doesn't have either. And in fact, I wonder in Belgium, because in Belgium the trade unions are also very important. And what is exactly their link with the Socialist Party? And could you imagine something like, a transformation of the Socialist Party on the line of what's happening with Corbyn and...
Well, the trade unions are independent from the party, and the party is independent from the trade unions. The difference with Britain is that it's the Socialist Party which created trade unions, and not the other way around in Belgium. Because first there was a political movement, and we realized that to be strong we needed trade unions. In Britain, trade unions created a party because they needed a political connection. So we remain very close, and trade unions also are quite divided. There's a Christian Democrat on the one hand, and then the Socialist on the other hand. There's even as a liberal trade union, which is typically Belgian, some kind of contradiction in terms, but it exists in Belgium. And so there is they're not part of the party, but we try to have very close connections with them and to get as many ideas. And I agree with you that there are lots of ideas everywhere in the society, not just in the trade unions, also in the NGOs, new social movements, new communities, and so on and so forth. And that ideas matter. Ideas really matter. You only win elections if you have a number of very good ideas, and then 2 or 3 proposals that become sort of iconic proposals of the... Look at the US again, and Bernie Sanders, his proposal for free access to higher education made an incredible success there. Because and why? Not just because it convinced young people or young people from the winning side of the society, but because I like this idea of Tony Judd, the historian, in his book Il Pairs, that what made social democracy so strong is that we managed at the time of the Golden Age to build messages that were by definition universal messages. We were not talking just to the working class or to the middle class. We were talking to 90% of the society, and that's the genius of the slogan, for the many, not the few, which I think is the best that European social democracy has found in the last 20 years, something like that. Because this is really what... if we try, the biggest challenge of the left, we shortly mentioned the division of the left between new radical reformism and traditional social democracy. That's one side. The other problem, certainly in my country, is how right-wing populism uses migration, refugees, and creates the myth of a migration crisis, because there is no real migration crisis. The situation nowadays is much less difficult than five years ago. But politically, there is indeed a sort of crisis of universalism. And they managed to use that to convince lots of people from the working class, or people who are suddenly in a very bad social situation, that to vote for them. And of course, it strengthens nationalist and very conservative and populist movements in many, many European countries. And this is a big challenge for the left. The left has to find a message, a narrative, a story, a number of simple ideas that speak to a wide audience, has to dare defending very universal message. Each time I'm asked about migration or refugees, I speak very honestly and I say, yes, there are international conventions, and all those people who respect the criteria of international conventions must be hosted in our country, and this is just one step. Then once they're there, we have to invest in their housing, school for their kids, and so on and so forth, and they will become part of the society in the next generation. But it's not easy to do. nowadays, in a context of xenophobic and even racist, anti-Semitic feelings which are strengthened due to this, the political manipulation of this so-called migration crisis. Italy is certainly the best example. But Spain, there again, is a counter-example. When Pedro Sanchez says, well, if Matteo Salvini doesn't want the Aquarius, Spain will host it. And he manages to get a political consensus. Nobody criticizes him.
Yeah, but there was never, in fact, Spain is precisely one of the few European countries where there've never been this anti-immigrants feeling.
Yeah, sure.
That's, and it's,
well,
no, but it's something.
It does exist. It does exist in Spain.
Well, yes, but there is a big difference. For example, the fact that they don't have a right-wing populist party in Spain. That's something really. No, Spain is an exception from that.
Spain is an exception. What is interesting is to understand why it is an exception. And how we can draw lessons from those exceptions. Greece, to some extent, is an exception too. Right-wing populism is very weak.
Also, for instance, the position of Greece with respect to immigrants has always been extremely generous, despite of the fact that they were really in a very...
But even in Italy, it's quite... I mean, the Lega Nord has been there for 30 years, but it's only become a very powerful political movement the last 5 years. So it's very important for the left to try and understand where right-wing populism wins and where it loses, for what reasons, and what kind of universal, not naive, generous message, but universalistic, clear on the values message we can forge and spread in the society to rebuild a wide support.
But there's uneven development as well, because the SDP in Germany is about to destroy itself. By going into this coalition with Merkel on the issue of immigration as well. I think, and what's interesting there, I think the leadership of the party will destroy the party, but there's a huge young generation that's come up. And it's interesting, the contacts that we've had with them is the young members of the party are actually inviting us over on a regular basis and building a counterweight to the leadership that there is there, because they see the folly of the leadership going into this coalition on this immigration policy, basically. That could destroy the whole credentials of the party for another generation.
And that takes us, in fact, to the other question that I wanted to ask you about right-wing populism and the way in which, to fight against it. But I think that, and you tell me again, because I don't know, I'm really ashamed not to know more about Belgian politics. But for instance, in the case of France, it's absolutely evident that the success of Marine Le Pen in area which were the north of Belgium, of France, which were basic people were used to vote for the communists there, and now it's really the place where Marine Le Pen is doing very good results, and it is due to the fact that those areas which are really all area around Amiens and Picardy, for instance, a lot of industry which have been destroyed, and then you've got a lot of workers who have been completely abandoned by the Socialist Party. I am absolutely convinced, and really that a great responsibility, and it's clear for France, but I think it's also true in other countries, of the rise of right-wing populism comes from the fact that the social parties have dedicated themselves to the middle class. They've abandoned the popular sector. I mean, in France, for instance, this think tank Terranova was a few years ago even saying we should not care about the working class. Those people are lost for us. They would definitely vote for Marine Le Pen. We should concentrate on the middle class and the immigrants, because the immigrants are less likely to vote Marine Le Pen. So they offer those groups, the working class, to Marine Le Pen. And in fact, it's quite interesting, and of course you are going to say that I'm doing again publicity for Mélenchon, but for instance, for the first time now in France, we've got a left party that is really trying to win back for the left those constituencies. And for instance, it's quite remarkable that in the last election, two of the candidates, La France Insoumise, Mélenchon in Marseille and François Ruffin in Amiens, they managed to win back area which were previously dominated by Marine Le Pen. And no vote for La France Insoumise. And for instance, I'm a friend of François Ruffin. I know very well what. When we were going, we were discussing with those people. And trying to understand, why do they vote for Marine Le Pen? And we understood that because the discourse that was available was she would go and say, I understand, your concern, but it's the immigrants that are responsible for the fact that you've lost your job or the fact that there are problems with them. And I had to convince them, no, it's not the immigrants, it is the big transnational corporation. Those are the people who are doing it. But, and when you've got this discourse available, I think it's really possible to win back certain of those people. Of course, there will always be people who are country, but a lot of people vote for right-wing populist parties because they've been abandoned by Social Democrats. I don't know, and of course, in the case of, to ask you that about Belgium, and if you say yes, it will be some kind of autocritic of the Socialist Party, which probably, I don't know if you want to do that, but maybe the situation is different. Do you think that something similar in Belgium happens with respect to the move of certain working class groups towards the right-wing populists?
Well, the situation in France and Belgium is quite different. You're right to say that the Socialist Party, but also the Communist Party to some extent, has abandoned the working class. Worse than that, why did François Hollande win the presidential elections? Because he had won working class and the students back at that time. He had managed, with his big discours of Le Bourget, against the finance, against capitalism, mon adversaire c'est la finance, my enemy is finance, and so on and so forth. He had managed to reconvince wide parts of those people from the abandoned territories that, yes, there was someone talking in the right direction, that they would vote for him. And then he did exactly the contrary when he became president, which is worse than just abandoning him. It would have been better not to say anything than to say, I'm going to fight the finance, and not to do it. That's one aspect, and certainly the Socialist Party, the Labour Party to some extent, certainly the Spanish Socialist, and in many countries, in the years 2000, with the sociological change that I mentioned in my first intervention, they said, well, of course, the working class is becoming a very narrow category, less than 15% of the population, and then we have widest groups of employees, students, people with a university degree, and so on and so forth. And so we have to be, as a socialist movement, loyal to our values. We have to be more open to that new middle class. That was really a conscious strategy, I think, of those parties, to say the society is changing, so we cannot be just the party of the working class. We have to be open to students. And by doing that,
not anymore,
and I would say the difference between the Belgian and the French Socialist Party in this respect is that I think we managed to open the party to those new progressive categories without completely losing the working class. But we lost a part of it, that's for sure, because of the defensive compromise that we had to make when we were in coalitions, and probably also because of some kind of professionalization, bureaucratization of the party itself, which impedes us from gaining new members. We still have a procedure of election of the leader, which is a completely internal, completely closed procedure, and I'm sure if we decided to open it to people who share our ideas and want to share the next leader of the party, we would gain lots of members and reopen a discussion in the society and unleash the creativity, as you said earlier in the discussion. But this is the kind of reforms that I think the question of process, of democratic process within the social democracy, is as important as the question of the values and the proposals that we make. We need both. And the reflection about the strategy, the process, the democratization of social democracy. Cédar Senghor had a very nice, the president of the Socialist Party from Senegal, president of Senegal, had a very nice phrase when he said, in the phrase social democracy or democratic socialism, democratic is more important than socialism. And I agree with that. If a society is very democratic, by definition, it will be, this is my deep democratic belief, it will be progressive, and it will go in the direction of the many and not the few. And if it's not democratic, by definition, it will it will make it will go in the advantage of the few. So we have to be strongly and radically democratic, and this is one of the aspects of social democracy that needs to be rejuvenated.
Do you agree with that or not?
Let me roll it back one. You posed the question about the potential vulnerability of working people to right-wing populism. Let me just complement what you've been saying, which is New Labour had a Faustian pact with finance capital, unconstrained, as long as there was an element that they could introduce by way of taxation levies that could then provide them some resources to invest in social progressive policies around the welfare state in particular. And that was the Faustian pact. The problem with that Faustian pact is if you allow finance capital to dominate an economy, that means actually your manufacturing base will often go and be undermined, and there'll be nothing to replace the traditional industries that then go. And that's what's happened in this country. So when you tour around the northern towns in particular, smaller towns, not the cities, smaller towns, coastal towns as well, you'll see whole economies that have collapsed, traditional industries that have collapsed, and not been replaced by anything. That leaves them open to then the exploitation of the right on issues around immigration. And that's the Brexit vote. That's the Brexit vote. The Brexit vote was like a by-election vote. Everyone's grievance poured into that one vote. That doesn't mean to say they didn't have criticism genuine of the need for reform of the EU or whatever, but everyone's anger went into that vote within particular areas. And most of those areas were some of the most deprived around the community, where they've lost their traditional base, where the manufacturing base had gone, where it hadn't been in any way replaced by anything that you could see other than low pay, insecure work. So it's understandable why people are pretty angry. And that was the relationship between New Labour and finance capital. As I said, it's Faustian pact. Do what you want, because as long as you pay some taxes, and that will enable us to keep afloat some of the public services that we need. I don't think there was a conscious decision on electoral terms that we just have to attract this middle class vote and abandon the working class. I think there was a genuine view that you had to have as wide a coalition as possible. But what then happened is that because finance capital then actually wasn't delivering the goods, what then happened is that you saw every element under New Labour of the broad coalition that took us into power into 97 being alienated. So increase in the pension by 75p was one, if you remember, policy that alienated older people. We then had the alienation of the Greens by the development of nuclear power in particular, and fracking and the other ideas coming forward, again dominated by finance capital because they were fast buck investments that were going in. You then had the alienation of teachers because of frozen pay or league tables, the dominance of the ideology of the market actually penetrated into the public services themselves. So what happened is between 97 and 2005 and 2010 was the coalition that took Labour to power in 97, section by section, systematically alienated. You couldn't have done worse if you'd intended to do it, to be honest. And it was quite remarkable. And that was because of the dominance of finance capital in our economic life. So what we're doing now it's hard work. Literally on a fortnightly basis, we're holding seminars within these individual towns, town meetings. Just doing an analysis of here's your economy as it now stands with the stats. How is it for you? What was it like? What do you think is needed? A lot of it is basic stuff as well. Infrastructure, road, rail, new technology, digital, all of that. People are buzzing with ideas about what would be wanted for the future. And then it's the discussion, well, how can we do it? And that's the discussion of the role of the local, regional and national state and what we can do. So that's evolving now as part of our thinking at that very low level. But it does mean the relationship with finance capital, the city, has to change quite dramatically. And we're doing that by being straight with them. You know, we will tax you more. We expect you to invest into the productive section of the economy rather than at the moment what's happening. The productive side of the economy is producing the money, it's going into the city, and it's going into property speculation. And it's bizarre in this country. Agriculture around is the price of it is going through the roof at the moment, whilst agricultural production is declining, and that's because of property speculation about the development of housing, etc. So again, we're having a frank discussion with finance capital. We're saying to them, this is what we want to do. You will get a reasonable return on your investments, but we won't be ripped off anymore. These are the limits to introduce the Tobin tax and those discussions, etc. What's interesting is that because of the current state of the economy and because of the current state of our government, particularly about their disarray over Brexit, we're beginning to construct a relationship which is realistic and relatively productive. They get a bit of a surprise at the end of the meeting when I say thank you, comrades, but it's developing on in that way. It's moving on from what was not just electoral consideration by the party about where our votes will come from. It was an economic policy, if you like, of the last government that allowed those towns and regions to be neglected, and so no wonder they were looking for.
Yeah, but you see, for instance, I think it's in thinking of, in terms of what you were saying before, the hegemony of neoliberalism, because I think that, in a sense, it was almost inevitable that socialist parties, which would become neoliberalized and basically accept that there was no alternative to neoliberal globalization, would be led to abandon the working class, because those were the losers of neoliberal globalization. And if you think that there is no alternative, you can't have a discourse with respect to those people. And this is why, for me, I think that really, in order to win back those people, it is absolutely vital to offer an alternative to neoliberalism. And my question is that all your discussion with them, are you thinking of your project as something which is, let's say, to some remedy to make neoliberalism a little bit less awful? Or are you really thinking of a rupture?
No, it's to tear it up, it's to destroy it.
Yeah. Okay,
it's to completely undermine it. They don't need me much to say that. It's happening anyway. It's happening in the real world, but it is not delivering. So people are saying, well, what will deliver? And we're saying, well, there are alternatives, and here's some of the alternatives, let's discuss them. But let's discuss them concretely within your community, so it's not some theory up here or whatever. But also, I think, if you go into the City of London, if they read the Daily Mail and the Telegraph and all the rest of it, they're expecting me to walk in as a Marxist, nationalise them and send them on a re-education camp in St Helens or something. We have a concrete discussion about this is what we're going to do. These are the sectors we're bringing back into public ownership, the public utilities, water, rail and Royal Mail and part of energy. Get used to it, because that's going to happen. Now let's talk seriously about the scale of investment that we need in research and development, in new technology, in infrastructure, etc., and the rate of return that you expect if you're working alongside us in that. We're setting up a strategic investment board, which involves the Treasury, Bank of England, the trade unions, and the finance sector and others. So representative of business, if you want to cooperate and work within that, please do so. And the response is actually now people looking for stability, because they see the uncertainties under this government, particularly with regard to Brexit, and now looking for stability with Labour. Now, I'm not expecting them to break out into street parties in the City of London when we get elected, but actually we'll have a working relationship, which I think will be relatively constructive. But it will be based on our terms, and our terms will be about, it's what the Tony Benn arguing, an irreversible shift in power and wealth in favour of working people. We're adding to that an irreversible shift in power and wealth and ownership in favour of working people as well. So ideas around how we develop common ownership, not just on the traditional nationalisation, because that's not what we want to go to. We want to go for forms of ownership which are much more democratic and open and locally based than ever before, but also the development of cooperation as a larger sector within our society. And then looking also about the potential of profit sharing by way of collective shareholdings with individual companies on an incremental basis. And again, what we're saying is we'll be open and transparent on that, because the one thing that the city don't want is surprises. So we're saying when we go to government, you'll know exactly.
So you don't expect a big antagonism with the city when we come?
No. All these arguments that they put forward, that there'll be a run on the pound and all the rest of it, my worry will be the pound going up.
And the Brexit will help in this respect.
Yeah, well,
the uncertainty it creates for the business community.
It's a nightmare. It's an absolute nightmare for everyone, really. And the point is as well that somehow someone's got to bring the country back together again in some form or compromise, and no one else can do that apart from us.
Because it's a nightmare. There's a quest for stability from all sides.
Yeah, exactly.
In this respect, it helps rebuild some kind of consensus.
But one of the ways they're trying to undermine us at the moment is that. From all sides, is that there's Jeremy Corbyn leadership, is North London, is Metropolitan, coffee drinking elite and all this sort of thing. Most of us are all
left.
Exactly, yes. And that we have no connection with the northern working class, that sort of thing. And it's interesting, they're using that as a line of attack. But if you look at our shadow cabinet,
you say they use
the media and the Tories, even the Tories, but the right-wing commentary, you know, and also some of our own opponents with our own thing, you know. Alistair Campbell refers to Jeremy and me as posh boys. So I love it. I was born in Scotland Road in Liverpool, one of the worst slums in Europe, you know. But it's a way in which they try to say, well, you're disconnected from the working class. Quite the reverse.
Because Blair was more connected.
Yes, but it's good point. But it's quite the reverse. But it's interesting that they use that line of attack because it reflects what their politics might have been, where they saw their electoral support. The issue for us is that, and this is the problem with the Brexit, and this is the issue around having another referendum. Brexit opened up the opportunity for the populist right, particularly around UKIP in particular, to mobilise an anti-immigration feeling. And we've got to repair that over time. And that's why I'm worried if we went for another referendum, it would open up the opportunity of that again. That's why we're saying we're not opposed to any form of democratic engagement, but it'd be better be a general election when you can have the wider debate about all the other issues.
And the people's vote is not...
Well, again, we've not ruled anything out, but I'd rather have a general election than one just specifically on Brexit, because we'd want to broaden up the whole issues. But we'll see how it moves on. But it's interesting that they've used that argument against us, somehow you're cut off from the working class. But if you look at our representation in Parliament now, increasingly the younger generation that's come in, and look at our shadow cabinet, 50% women, many of them sons and daughters of working class families, if not working class themselves.
So what do you think that the Belgian socialists can learn from the experience of Corbyn, Paul?
Well, the differences between the institutional and political context are so deep that it's not easy to draw direct lessons. I mean, we are we will keep being a member of the European Union. We're founding members. The relationship to the EU is quite strange in Belgium because on the one hand there is a very strong European commitment, on the other hand there's a lot of discontent against the EU as it is now, and especially in the working class. We are in a proportional system and so on and so forth. So the differences are very deep. I agree that we need a decentralized process, very democratic and open process within the party. In fact, we've been doing that for 18 months. For the last 18 months, we've organized debates everywhere in Belgium with trade unions, with NGOs, with intellectuals in the universities, with new social movement and so on and so forth. And it has helped us find a number of ideas. But what we still miss, I think, is a clear political economy. And I keep saying that within the party, we still are, I mean, our vision of public ownership, the role of the state, investment and that kind of thing remains, for me, as a member of that party, too vague. I mean, we have lots of small ideas here and there, strengthening participation of the workers within the company, better wages, obviously, better pensions, some kind of basic income for young people who do not find a job. So we have lots of small ideas here and there, but a sort of clear and simple vision of the economy could be different if, and that would be the economy that we would support. We're still missing that message, and I think this is very important because people do understand the economy much better than we believe. I mean, they have a clear vision of the basic mechanisms of capitalism and what is good for them and what is not good for them. They understand that very perfectly. I mean, the working class at least, when you speak with them. So we need to have a very clear message in this respect, and then we need to see how we can build coalitions, because not just political coalitions, but coalitions within the society. How do we first build a wide movement within the society to make sure that the left in its different elements would be big enough to be able to say we would be around the table when we negotiate. That's the first step. And then how can we find, on a number of issues, messages that are so strong that even the right cannot go against them. I give one example. We're discussing about that in the Socialist and Democratic group at the European level. The fight against poverty. This is really something that I think the left, to a wide extent, has abandoned. I mean, and really, I've never understood that. We've had discussion within my party, people saying, well, yes, but we cannot always say that we work for the poor people. If we do that, we are perceived by the electorate as a party which make things for the unemployed, for the people who are retired, for people who are poor, and we will lose the middle class. So let's not talk too much about the fight against poverty. I fully disagree with that.
Yeah, but there is also, in fact, a pauperization of the middle class.
Sure, and even of the working class, indeed. First, saying that you want to eradicate poverty is giving a clear, in one generation. You will not do that in 5 years' time. But between the start of, in the very first years of the 20th century, 80% of the population was poor, and 20% was not poor. We managed to reverse that. We have 20% of the population who are poor, and 80% who are not poor anymore. We can, if we take the decision, it's quite easy to know how we have to invest in childcare, in housing, in free education for everyone, in access to health service, and to eradicate poverty in one generation. But we have to take this as a big challenge that we take as our responsibility and say to the Greens, say to the Christian Democrats, say even to some elements of the liberal movements, would you agree to spend that amount of money in housing, education, childcare and so on, with the common purpose of eradicating poverty? I mean, we always talk of eradicating poverty in China, in India, in Africa, but not in Europe. I mean, and we tend to be to get used to live with the idea that 1 people on 5 lives in poverty. I mean, it's a moral scandal. It's a political something that should not be seen as a fatality. And I think it's a strong responsibility for the left to say, yes, we can. Again, to show that it is possible and that we have a strong purpose and we know how to do it. And then we build the moral and the social and the political coalition that will bring that purpose together. And this, I think, is the kind of things that the left can do and should do in Europe.
But don't you think that instead of, this fight against poverty couldn't be better to put in a more general narrative that, for instance, fight for equality? Because equality includes the fight against poverty.
Sure.
Because you can't be equal if you are really... and on the other side, it seems that the fight for... you were speaking before of the importance of universalist things. But I think that if we are... Because that's one of the real consequences of the hegemony of neoliberalism, the fact that equality has almost disappeared from the popular... I remember, for instance, Tony Blair was choice. No, it was really we were going to give a proposition, you choose your doctor, you choose your school, but very seldom did he ever speak about equality. And I think that is, for me, one of the characteristics of the fact that the left is abandoned, is not even present in the discourse. So I think that is very important to reintroduce that and to be having, let's say, the kind of hegemonic signifier around which a lot of other struggle can be articulated.
Sure,
because on the question of equality, you can have also, for instance, the social movement and many people saying, I think that's
right, but
really
the fight against inequality is so wide that it's women's rights,
but exactly, but it encompasses things, and we could say, for instance, that one of the first things is that eliminate poverty. I agree with you, it's important, but to put it in a more general, struggle.
But the first victims of poverty are women, are migrants, are worker people, and so on and so forth. Are children.
That's what you can have intersectional.
It's always the weakest, the most vulnerable members of society who are the victims of poverty, and so and people do not believe anymore that it's possible. And you can demonstrate that yes, it would be possible if we would take the right decisions. Tax more the rich people, invest in this and that sector, and not in 5 years' time, but in one generation we can do it. Then you give some direction in the society, which which is less.
I still think less the idea of
conceptual, less conceptual than.
No, but equality is more encompassing, I think.
Yeah, it's very encompassing, and because it's very encompassing, it's a bit too abstract, I think. We need concrete things.
I don't know. What do you think, John?
I think my view now is. I think we have to operate like the social movement, which is campaigning against every injustice that we identify. And so when that small group of people turn up, I met the WASPy women yesterday. These are the women who have been denied their pension as a result of a government change of policy. And so they're now retiring, but they've lost their pension because their retirement age has been pushed back. And there's that's a huge injustice, but there's all these injustices that you come across. And you meet these people who just mobilising, campaigning in the face of politicians, taking direct action, that sort of thing. We've got to operate like a social movement where wherever social injustice is identified, we're behind it. And
So you mean key signifier social justice, that would be, according to you, the more important?
It is.
So here we've got three proposals: fight against poverty, fight for equality, and fight for social justice. Well, it's all the same.
It's all the same. All I'm saying is that as a movement now, there are so many struggles that are going on. Like we've got to be so adaptive and so comprehensive in the way that we organise. And when those individuals, no matter how small, wherever I go at the moment, and maybe it's me, I don't know, but wherever I go, there are people out there campaigning on things, whether it's a group that are being arrested by the police on a regular basis against fracking or something, whether it's the WASPy women, whether it's the mental health campaign, whatever. And they're all, it's interesting, increasingly now, individual campaigns, individual struggles like that are increasingly gaining solidarity across the piece. And those social connections are happening again. Now, whereas in the past, maybe the party of the Labour movement, the trade union movement would be the focus of that, those other social connections are being made. That breadth of solidarity is just increasingly enormous. And it's interesting, sometimes I was listening to a speaker the other day on one of the campaigns, turning the right-wing slogans against them as well. Taking back control. We want to take back control of our community. And it was what that was, our planning system is virtually collapsed now because of the degradation of local government. And what that was all about is a group of people who have come forward, and they're now acting as our advisors, campaigning about land ownership. Who owns the land? In Scotland, there's a massive campaign. And this is a group of people now saying, right, we're George Monbiot and others coming together and advising us and saying we want to now set up land trusts across the country where we take the land back off against these owners. The fires that are going on in north of Manchester at the moment, I didn't realise that most of these are grouse moors that are publicly subsidised through taxation. And again, people are coming together and saying how unjust these are. And it is about democracy, which is taking back to control the people themselves.
But that's why I think it's important to federate all those struggles. Because there is some form of left who say that all those struggles are important, but let them do.
Not individually.
I think that is very important to find a way to federate them.
Well, I think the role of the Labour Party now is not just as a traditional Labour Party, which is just getting elected. The role of the Labour Party is to be the facilitator of solidarity action, resourcing as best we can and supporting as best we can. So I keep saying now, the role of a Labour MP now is as much on the picket line as it is in Parliament. And I think that's...
I keep saying that.
So you agree with
Make
that
less
too?
laws, go and work in the street.
There is a last question that I would like to...
There's also an issue of time, which is very important to explain why it works. You've been in the opposition for time long enough for you to be credible as an alternative, which is not the case for my party, for example. We can only be in the position
you're not in
for 3 years.
opposition enough.
So you say, well, you've been in power for 30 years. Why haven't you done it?
Exactly.
And that's second. You can build a narrative which is, we are a new party compared to the former, the so-called new Labour. We are something new because we've changed the logic of leadership. We changed the way we work. We changed the message, and we've brought it back to a narrative that was very powerful for a very long time, which is not the case of an.
But you could try to do it.
We should. I'm thinking about it. It's also a question of internal process generation.
Exactly, the mood for election, the leader, and all those things.
It's a question of the fortuna. It's a question of moments. You need to find the right moment.
Fortuna and virtue.
Fortuna and virtue. Well, the virtue is there, but the fortuna, you are waiting for the fortuna moment.
I'm waiting for the kairos, is the Greek the kairos.
Okay, last question, because you first, we in fact not developed that question of right-wing populism, and you are saying about the, well, I don't know if I understood, I interpreted that in a special way, the kind of universalist discourse. Well, I think that I feel that one of the main problems, it seems to be particularly on the continent, as we say here, is that the people believe that the fight against right-wing populism should be one of moral condemnation. You know, that's fascist, that's... and in fact, recently when Macron speaks of a leper, is you understood that? La lèpre. I think that's really, you know, is presenting that as some kind of moral disease, which have no basic, you know, socio-economic form of explanation. And I think that is completely counterproductive. In presenting those people, I remember, for instance, I was already shocked, that was a long time ago, in the year 2000, when there was the first coalition in Austria between the Conservative and the FPÖ. That time it was under Gorkheider, and because in fact the FPÖ had got 27% in the election, and there was Elfriede Jelinek, Prize Nobel for Literature, who declared we should not even speak with the people who vote for the FPÖ. Those people are, and I was thinking, okay, so it means that there is 27% of the population of Austria which are kind of, you know, I think that's really a mistake to do their critique in terms of moral condemnation, and this is not the way in which we are going to win them back. And I think that, of course, it's very convenient for social democratic parties who are in part responsible of that, because they don't have to make any kind of autocritique, you know, and wonder why, what did we wrongly that those people, because, it's a moral disease, it's a leper and things like that. But I think that's for me is really, and it's, for instance, the reaction about what's happening in Italy at the moment was very, very strong of that. In France, the critique of Marine Le Pen is very much on those kind of lines. I don't really know if in Belgium is the case. But I think that this is something which is for me completely counterproductive, and that we should really have some kind of political discourse. And well, what we were saying before, you can't win back those people if you don't address their demand and give them some kind of another progressive answer. And that requires to really break with, you know, the hegemony of neoliberalism and offer another project. Yeah. What do you think about that?
I think you're right. We should never leave the nation to the right. Jean Jaurès said the nation is the only common good of the poor people. But yet, there is a progressive vision of the nation, which I mean, we must fight against the conservative vision, nationalistic vision. We should have our own vision of what a nation is. And there are some symbolic moments which help us doing that, especially with the football competition now. When you look at the Red Devils, I mean, 2/3 of the football players are coming from the immigration. And it's a fascinating movement to see all those people with the Belgian flags singing the Belgian hymn and being so proud for the Red Devils, and being so proud that the son of American workers who worked in the mines, the son of a Congolese worker and son are just winning against Japan or another team, and you don't hear the nationalists anymore those days, because they don't know what to do. First, they hate the Belgian flag, and second, they hate immigration. So, I mean, it's the worst moment of their life. And I'm not, of course, this is not something that you can use politically, not easily. But if you can understand that there is something in the nation which is really universalistic, and which is not something, it's not ethno-linguistic or ethno-nationalistic. The nation is a group of people who share a number of visions and a number of values and a project, and you manage to not just to build that vision of society, but also to explain it to the people. I'm always convinced that it's possible. It's not easy, but I'm campaigning for local elections, because I have campaigning local elections in October, so I'm in the streets nearly every day, not today obviously, and I talk to people, and very often they would say, well, but it's everything for the refugees, and it's everything for the migrants. It only takes 2.5 minutes to explain, no, it's not true. It's not everything for them. They have the same rights. This is the reason why, and so on and so forth. And then you see your neighbor is from Morocco, and so it's not that easy to go against that kind of, but you have to dare doing it, and you have to take it as your responsibility to be honest about that, not a sort of naive vision of a cosmopolitan world that would have no boundaries and so on and so on. Yes, there are nations, yes, there are criteria in terms of respecting the constitution, of learning the language of the country, of having duties like everyone. If you respect all those criteria and you are on the ground you are a citizen of that country and you share the visions and the project of the country. And this is a very powerful vision too. This republican vision of the nation, historically forced, is something which really talks to many people, and you manage to convince them. And ethno-nationalism is, I think, in the long run, weaker than the republican vision of the nation. But we dare to defend it, and we dare to make it part of the leftist progress, and not that kind of
patriotism. I think I would.
Yeah, like some kind of left-wing patriotism. Which is easy to combine with Europeanism, because it's a mistake to think that you have to choose between your national and your European identity. Sociological studies have demonstrated in France at the time of the constitutional referendum 2005 that the people that had voted for the EU basically were the people with the strongest national identity, and not the other way around. Is the people who who vote against the EU very often are people who feel uncomfortable in their own national identity. When you feel confident with national identity, it's very easy to become a member of a wider community. So it's not that difficult to defend, but we have to dare doing it.
So I agree with that, but you have to also think creatively about the way nationalism has been used in a way which is the right is used counterproductively. So a lot of nationalism in this country used by the right is on the basis of it as quite a militaristic role of the empire in the past. And we've been thinking through how do you turn that round. And actually one of the things we want to try and do is just develop the role of Britain in the world as one that leads the world in terms of conflict prevention, conflict resolution, that sort of thing. And it's trying to actually confront those historical legacies and turn them into advantages. So that's one of the discussion we've had. The second thing as well, you just have to understand that people do have a sense of place. Mm-hmm. A lot of the work that you need to do in terms of developing your policies now relate to that sense of place, family and place, etc. So that does translate into a sense of place as a nation as well. I agree with you. I think people who feel comfortable in their own skin with regard to nationalism can then feel themselves more about their global role, their European role, etc. Because we're such a multicultural community as well, people have transversed that thing about, I can support India at cricket as well as support England at football, that sort of thing.
Well, we are not going to ever fly. Is there a possibility that Belgium will play against England or not? Yes? Is that possible? Is that no, it's possible. Oh my goodness.
There was a secret treaty about it.
But so it is factable that we will have that Belgium. Oh my goodness. So that's.
But also, again, on the left, we have to be more professional than the right. And for the years, we did it in the 80s, now we're back into some influence from the Labour Party. It is down to how do you communicate. So we test now every word, with the focus groups and all the rest of it. We don't go along and say, what do you want us to say? We say, this is the message we want to get across, what are the words that most effectively we can use. And the way in which we're doing that at the moment is going into those towns where we've lost our seats, the Mansfields and other towns where we've just lost seats, where we've lost sitting Labour MPs or seats that we could have gained. And we're deliberately bringing together those people who voted UKIP last time around to talk through those issues. What was it that motivated you in that way? And by the way, we want to, with this policy, we want to develop. What do you think about it? And we want to sell it in this way. Funnily enough, the Financial Times did a similar thing a month ago, and they got a focus group together and put our policies towards them, water, nationalisations and the trading rights, etc. Overwhelming support, and then they said, well, they're Labour policies, and the support declined immediately, and that's a carryover of the brand So again, what we've got to do is look at the branding of how we shape the image of the party as well. Now, that sounds very New Labourish, but actually we were doing that in the 1980s. And it was because how do we ensure that the way in which we communicate is the most effectively possibly can. The left has always got to lead on those ideas. Finally, I'll tell you one small thing, joke if you like. I'm a Liverpool supporter, and John Barnes was the first black player that played for Liverpool. And he had a really rough time, people throwing bananas on the pitch and all the rest of it. One week we played against our rivals, Everton, and they were giving him stick, the racist stick and all the rest. The Liverpool supporters then became completely anti-racist, and I thought those typical Everton and all the rest of it. And it's that sort of actually sense of solidarity, and I raised that because it's interesting, on all the anti-immigration feeling that UKIP was trying to stir up. When we had that picture of that young child's body on the beaches in Greece, it transformed the debate here actually. And people started thinking, what is our responsibility in providing support and succour to asylum seekers and refugees? And it's that sort of campaigning around to turn it that we can. And now people do feel a sense of pride about the role that we can play as a country. And they're condemning this existing government now for not supporting, for example, the Dove's Amendment to bring more children into the country and support. So you can see how on the left, if we're strategic and professional about our approach and creative about our approach, we can turn these arguments and build senses of solidarity beyond just the nation state.
Yeah, but that's required, and in fact that's also something suggested, because I agree with you totally that ideas are very important, but ideas are only ever forced when they meet affects. You know, it's not a question of coming with ideas. No. You need to have this conjunction with affects. I remember, for instance, that was many years ago, but a discussion I had with a very important left-wing political theorist in the US was saying the problem with the working class in the US is that they don't know the Marxist theory of value. If they will know the Marxist theory of value, they will understand that they are exploited and they will all become socialists. So he was very consequent. He was trying to organize all over the US school to teach to the workers the Marxist theory of value. And I was telling him, but look, I'm sorry, but I don't think that's really the way. Of course you did, but you need to find ideas. It's not a question of rationality. I think that the left is usually too rationally. They don't really give enough importance to emotion and to what I call the passion. And they consider, oh, no, that's what the right does. You know, we are only give arguments. And I think that's very dangerous, because if we leave that field to the right, of course they mobilize it in another direction.
I think the current strikers in McDonald's understand the Marxist theory of value on a daily basis.
I think many workers do perfectly understand the Marxist theory of value. I mean, they say, I work 40 hours a week, I only win this, and I would deserve more, so they perfectly understand it.
Okay, well, so it's exactly 7 o'clock, I'm sorry, but we don't, have time for discussion, but we had a very interesting discussion with our two speakers, which I thanks a lot, and I thank you too for attending, so please thank John McDonnell and Paul Magnette for this discussion. Invited to drink reception.